When most fighters enter the octagon, it's business. For Nate Diaz, it's personal. He didn't show up to outpoint you. He showed up to make you regret signing the contract. And if you crossed a certain line with him, you'd feel it. In this video, we're counting down the 5 fighters Nate Diaz truly couldn't stand. Not for headlines, not for hype, but because of something real. From backstage brawls and press conference chaos to street fights and middle fingers, these are the rivalries that turned into all-out wars. And number 1, let's just say, the hate never really ended. Most UFC fighters are tough, but Nate Diaz, he made tough look tame. This wasn't just a man who came to fight. He came to settle scores, to throw hands like it was personal, because for him, it almost always was. In a sport where rivalries are hyped up for the camera, Nate Diaz stood out for one reason. He never faked it. If he liked you, you knew it. If he hated you, you really knew it. He never smiled for the press, never shook hands just to play along. And when he walked to the cage, he didn't look like a professional athlete. He looked like a guy who just stepped out of a Stockton alley, ready to throw down. No suits, no scripts, just raw, unapologetic energy. What made Diaz different wasn't just his fight style, it was the way he handled disrespect. A slight in an interview? He'd remember. A phony handshake backstage? That could get you slapped. He had no patience for what he saw as fake humility, or company guys playing nice for the UFC. When he said he was going to slap you, he meant it, and a few fighters found that out the hard way. But who really pushed him to that edge? Which opponents crossed the line so badly that Nate Diaz made it his mission to humble them in front of the world? This isn't just a list of trash talk. These are fighters who ended up on the wrong side of Nate's fury, not for show, but because he truly couldn't stand them. And what's wild is that some of these beefs started with respect. Others were born from pure chaos. Some ended in blood. Others never got the closure they deserved. But one thing connects them all. When Nate Diaz decided he didn't like you, there was no going back. From press conference meltdowns to backstage fights and verbal shootouts that never ended, these are the top 5 fighters Nate Diaz hated the most, and what happened when they got too close to the wrong man in MMA. And we start with someone who used to be a fan, until Nate made it personal. Before things got violent, there was actually mutual respect. Donald "Cowboy" Cerrone openly admired the Diaz brothers. He once said in an interview that he loved the way they showed up and brought real energy to every fight. He respected their authenticity, the raw, no-nonsense style that defined their careers. But respect only goes so far when pride is on the line. And Cerrone quickly found out that admiration doesn't earn you a free pass with Nate Diaz. It all started at a UFC gym event where the two crossed paths. Cerrone, being friendly, reached out to shake Nate's hand. What he got in return was a slap. Not a punch, not a shove, but a disrespectful slap of the hand and an insult to go with it. Cerrone was stunned. That moment instantly flipped the switch. Whatever good vibes he had toward Nate vanished. From his point of view, that was pure disrespect. And if you disrespect Cowboy, you're in for a long night. But in Nate's mind, that slap wasn't out of nowhere. He believed Cerrone was trying to play him, acting like a buddy just to make him look like the bad guy later. Nate wasn't about to play along. That encounter lit a fuse that would burn straight through to UFC 141. During fight week, tensions soared. The face-off at the press conference turned into a moment that MMA fans will never forget. Nate walked up to Cowboy, reached for his hat, and smacked it clean off his head before shoving him backward. No one saw it coming. It wasn't staged. Cerrone just stood there, boiling, but didn't retaliate. He knew the real fight was coming. When they finally met inside the cage, there was no touch of gloves, no nods, no sportsmanship, just 2 men ready to go to war. And Diaz wasted no time making it ugly. He taunted Cerrone from the start, talking trash, flipping him off between rounds, and walking him down with relentless pressure. It wasn't a tactical fight, it was a psychological assault. Diaz broke Cowboy down piece by piece, outlanding him with over 230 significant strikes, a lightweight record at the time. After the bell, the war was over. Cerrone, battered and bruised, swallowed his pride. He approached both Diaz Diaz brothers offered respect and, shockingly, they accepted. The beef cooled off. The grudge was buried. But for that one stretch of time, Donald Cerrone became a target. And Nate Diaz made sure he paid for the disrespect, whether it was real or not. But not every rivalry ends with mutual respect. Some, like the next one, festered for years and even spilled into a second sport entirely. In 2019, Nate Diaz returned from a layoff and beat Anthony Pettis in dominant fashion. After the fight, he didn't call out a title holder. He didn't ask for money fights or rematches. He lit the fuse for something new. On the mic with Joe Rogan, Nate said he was the baddest mother effer in the game, and that he wanted to defend that title against one man, Jorge Masvidal. That one moment set the wheels in motion for the UFC's first and only BMF title fight. Masvidal accepted. Dana White leaned into the chaos. The marketing took off, but beneath the respect between the two gangsters was a storm brewing. These were two men with similar street-born mentalities, both with chips on their shoulders and reputations built outside of the UFC's promotional machine, and that made them destined to clash. At UFC 244 in Madison Square Garden, the fight didn't disappoint, at least until the end. Masvidal got the better of the early rounds, slicing open a brutal cut above Nate's right eye. The crowd was loud. Nate was still standing, but after round 3, the doctor stopped the fight, just like that. Jorge was awarded the TKO. Nate wasn't dropped, he wasn't gassed, he was just cut. To say Diaz was furious would be an understatement. He paced the cage, waving off the result. The crowd booed. Even Masvidal said he wanted to run it back, but the rematch never came, at least not in the cage. Years passed. Nate fought out his UFC contract and went solo. Jorge headlined cards, fought for titles, and eventually retired. That seemed like the end until boxing called. In 2024, the beef reignited, this time with gloves and a different rule set. Nate and Jorge signed on for a boxing match, and the bad blood came rushing back. What was once respectful competition now turned personal. Press conferences got violent. Their teams brawled. Cameras caught punches thrown backstage. This wasn't marketing. This was war. When they finally stepped into the boxing ring, Nate edged out a majority decision. Masvidal immediately disputed the call, claiming the judges got it wrong. But Nate, he wasn't interested in arguing. For him, the fight was over, and so was the feud. He felt he had proven what needed to be proven. Whether Jorge agreed or not didn't matter. But if you think that was intense, the next rivalry on this list never even made it to the cage, and it still burns just as hot. The tension between Nate Diaz and Dustin Poirier wasn't forged in the Octagon. It was built through broken promises, failed contracts, and public call-outs that never led to a fight. And in Nate's world, nothing builds more resentment than a matchup that feels like it was stolen from him. In 2018, fight fans were buzzing. The UFC announced Diaz vs. Poirier as the co-main event for UFC 230 at Madison Square Garden. It was a big deal. Nate was returning after 2 years away, and Poirier was on a serious tear in the lightweight division. Everything about the matchup screamed fireworks, but behind the scenes, it was already starting to unravel. Just weeks before the event, Dustin pulled out with a reported hip injury. Surgery was needed, the fight was cancelled, and the card had to be reshuffled. On the surface, it seemed like an unfortunate but common part of the fight game. But if you asked Nate Diaz, it wasn't that simple. From Nate's perspective, Poirier never really wanted the fight. He believed Dustin used the injury as an out, avoiding a fight he wasn't truly ready for. Diaz publicly suggested that Poirier wasn't committed and was negotiating in bad faith. Meanwhile, Poirier had his own version. He claimed that Diaz had already begun backing out of the fight well before his injury went public. According to him, Nate was difficult behind the scenes, pushing back on contract terms, demanding changes, and negotiating himself out of the main event slot. "They offered us the main event," Poirier once said. "I accepted." Nate overplayed his hand. The whole thing fell apart. Whatever the truth is, the result was a missed fight that fans never forgot. The disappointment turned into frustration, and the frustration into animosity. Over the years, the two kept throwing verbal jabs. Twitter, interview, embedded clips. Poirier would call Diaz fake or unprofessional. Diaz would accuse Poirier of ducking. At one point, Nate even said He wanted Dustin to be his final UFC opponent. "I've been trying to make that fight happen. I want it," he said. But the call was never answered. The UFC didn't book it, and Poirier continued climbing the ranking. Even after Nate left the promotion, the feud didn't die. Both men occasionally bring each other up, usually with a smirk or a jab. There's unfinished business there, not because they traded shots, but because they never got to. And for Nate, that might sting more than a loss. But if Poirier was the rivalry that slipped away, the next one nearly exploded multiple times, and it all started with a slap. Of all the rivalries in Nate Diaz's career, the one with Khabib Nurmagomedov is the most volatile and the most surreal. It wasn't fought inside the cage. It was fought in crowded arenas, backstage hallways, and the lingering silence of a fight that never happened. It started back in 2015 at a World Series of Fighting event in Las Vegas. Nate wasn't even fighting. He was just there to support teammate Jake Shields. Khabib, on the other hand, was in attendance to corner his cousin. But somehow, even without gloves on, the situation got ugly fast. According to Nate, Khabib's team began mocking him from across the venue. They took a photo with Nate in the background and started laughing, trying to provoke him. That was all it took. Diaz stormed over and, without hesitation, slapped Khabib across the face. The scene devolved into chaos. Punches were thrown, security scrambled. The footage later went viral, and that one slap lit a fuse that never truly went out. Nate later described Khabib's fighting style as boring, mocking him for being a grappler with no real striking game. "He's a jock," Nate once said. "He's not a fighter like me. He just hugs guys for 5 rounds." He wasn't just criticizing his skill, he was attacking Khabib's identity. Khabib, for his part, didn't stay quiet. He later claimed that the UFC had tried to book him against Diaz several times, but Nate kept turning it down. "He talks big, but he doesn't want to be wrestled," Khabib said. "He knows what happens if we fight." Then came 2018. Both men were in Las Vegas again, this time for UFC 239. Once again, they crossed paths, and once again, it nearly erupted. Security rushed in before fists could fly, but witnesses say it was tense enough to turn violent in seconds. And yet, despite all of that, a sanctioned fight between the two was never made. Whether it was business, bad timing, or bad blood, fans never got to see Nate versus Khabib in the Octagon. And that may be why the grudge feels so permanent. For Nate, it wasn't just that he hated Khabib's style, it was the disrespect. From the pictures, from the press, from the way Khabib carried himself. That slap in 2015 wasn't just a reaction, it was a statement. But if this was a grudge born out of a real-life clash, the #1 rivalry on this list, that one was made for war, and it changed the UFC forever. In early 2016, Conor McGregor was untouchable. He had just knocked out Jose Aldo in 13 seconds, and he was gearing up to become a 2-division champ. When Rafael dos Anjos pulled out of their scheduled fight with an injury, the UFC scrambled. They needed a replacement. They needed someone dangerous, credible, and willing to step in on 11 days' notice. That someone was Nate Diaz. What followed was the stuff of legend. The press conferences were insane. Conor, in full alpha mode, launched insult after insult. He mocked Nate's career, his voice, his money, his record. "You're a millionaire for one night only," he sneered. "I built this company before you even existed." But Nate didn't just sit there. He bit back hard. "F you," he said. "Live on stage. Everybody's on steroids." It was chaos. Raw, unscripted, and absolutely electric. Then came UFC 196. McGregor started strong, landing bombs. Diaz bled, but he didn't back down. And then, in round 2, everything changed. Nate's boxing came alive. McGregor gasped. Diaz rocked him, took him down, and sunk in the choke. Just like that, the king had tapped. Post-fight, Nate grabbed the mic and dropped one of the most iconic lines in MMA history. "I'm not surprised, mother effer." McGregor couldn't handle it. He demanded an immediate rematch. The build-up to UFC 202 was even more hostile. At one press conference, Nate and his crew walked out early. Conor retaliated by throwing water bottles and cans of Monster across the room. "F you, Conor!" Nate screamed. Security couldn't contain it. Fans couldn't look away. The rematch was an all-out war. 5 grueling rounds. blood, slips, comebacks. Both men left everything in that cage. In the end, McGregor won by majority decision, but it wasn't definitive. It wasn't closure. It was 1-1. And to this day, the trilogy remains one of MMA's most painful, unfinished stories. The hate between these two was real. The history was real. And the wounds still open. Once the final bell rang and the blood dried from the canvas, you'd think these rivalries would fade like the bruises. For Nate Diaz, they didn't. The tension didn't stop at the final round. It lingered. After the Cerrone fight, after the Masvidal boxing match, even after McGregor too, the bitterness remained. Nate never fully buried the hatchet with any of them. Take Jorge Masvidal. Even after they boxed in 2024 and Nate got the win by majority decision, there was no warm handshake, no mutual respect speech. Masvidal disputed the outcome, and Nate shrugged him off. No third fight, no closure, just another page in Nate's book of unfinished business. Then there's Poirier. The fight never even happened, but it left a lasting sting on both men's careers. Fans still ask about it every time Diaz posts online, every time Dustin does an interview. The rivalry is a ghost fight, one that haunts both of them. Even Khabib, who retired undefeated and walked away from MMA with his legacy intact, couldn't fully shake off Nate. Years later, Diaz would still mock his style, call him a jock, and say he ran from real fights. The fact that Khabib never fought either Diaz's brother only fueled Nate's sense of contempt. In his mind, that was weakness. And McGregor, their second bout was a razor-close decision. And the fact that Conor never gave him a trilogy fight only made things worse. Nate didn't see it as strategic. He saw it as cowardly. He didn't want that third fight because he knew what was coming. Nate said once in an interview, "All of these rivalries were built on real feelings, not just press conference drama. That's why fans stayed invested long after the fights were over. Because in a sport filled with hype machines and PR spin, Nate Diaz's hate felt real. It wasn't manufactured. It wasn't for show. He lived it. And in return, so did the fan." But that brings us to a bigger question. Why did so many rivalries stick to Nate? Why did he always seem to be at the center of these storm clouds? The answer isn't just about trash talk. It goes deeper. There's a reason Nate Diaz rubbed so many people the wrong way. He was never the polished media darling. He didn't play the UFC politics game. He didn't change who he was to fit into a corporate structure. In a sport that increasingly became about branding, Nate stayed feral, and that rubbed a lot of fighters and a lot of executives the wrong way. When Nate walked into a press conference, he didn't show up in a suit. He showed up in a hoodie, eyes half-lidded, ready to curse someone out. He didn't smile for the cameras. He lit them up. And if a fighter tried to be friendly with him, like Donald Cerrone did, Nate saw it as fake. To him, friendliness before a fight was manipulation. "He's trying to shake my hand so I look like the bad guy when I don't," Nate once said. That. That attitude extended to everyone. If a fighter missed weight, talked too much, acted cocky, or even just gave off the wrong energy, Nate took it personally. He saw it as disrespect. And in his world, disrespect had consequences. He also had a deep distrust of how the UFC operated. He felt that certain fighters were protected, pushed forward by the promotion even when they didn't earn it. Conor, Khabib, even Poirier to some degree. Nate always saw himself and his brother Nick as outsiders, fighters who had to bleed twice as hard to get half the spotlight. And when he finally did get the attention, he didn't thank anyone. He didn't hug Dana White or shake hands backstage. He flipped off the camera and said what he wanted. This is why his rivalries felt more real than most. Because in Nate's mind, every opponent represented more than just a fighter. They represented the system, the favoritism, the fake handshakes, the forced smiles. Diaz was the anti-celebrity in a sport built on personas, and that made him dangerous, not just to his opponents, but to the entire UFC business model. But even with all that raw energy, all the middle fingers, and all the beefs, there's something underneath it all that explains why fans still love him. Something that ties all these rivalries together and reveals what truly made Nate Diaz different. Strip away the anger. Take away the insults. the water bottles, the brawls, and the slaps. And what you're left with is a fighter who never pretended. That's what made Nate Diaz special. It wasn't just that he hated his rivals, it's that he never faked respect when it wasn't real. In an industry where showmanship often blurs into salesmanship, Nate Diaz reminded fans what a real fighter looks like. Raw, flawed, emotional, and always honest. He didn't trash talk because it was marketable. He did it because he meant it. And that authenticity gave his rivalries weight. When Nate said he hated you, you believed him. When he walked into the cage with a chip on his shoulder, it wasn't just for drama. It was because he carried years of resentment, disrespect, and fight politics on his back. This is why his win over McGregor wasn't just an upset, it was a revolution. Why the BMF belt wasn't just a gimmick. It was a spiritual title that Nate felt belonged to him. Why every fight, even if he lost, felt like a moral victory to fans who shared his distrust of the system. Nate's legacy isn't defined by titles or win-loss records. It's defined by principle. He didn't chase belts. He chased respect. He didn't fake beefs. He turned real ones into iconic wars. And when he hated someone, he made sure the world knew why. That's why, to this day, every Nate Diaz rivalry still gets clicks, views, and endless debate. Because he turned hate into art. And in doing so, he gave MMA fans something they didn't even know they missed. Truth in a sea of performance. Whether or not he fights again, one thing's for sure. The names Cerrone, Masvidal, Poirier, Khabib, and McGregor will always be linked to Nate Diaz. Not because of the UFC's matchmaking, but because of the fire he brought every time their paths crossed. And in that fire, Nate Diaz found his legacy.